Hello, we're going to talk about the supplies that we use for painting in watercolors today. Now these are not mandatory colors supplies. These are just the supplies that I use and suggestions for you. So you don't need to run out and buy a whole bunch of different supplies. What you have around the house a lot of times will work. For example, Kleenex. I always like to leave a box of Kleenex right close to me while I'm painting. This happens to be cloth baby diapers, so I fold it up like this and I leave one here, and I always have one on my lap. I have some extra ones laying around because they do get wet, so you can just hang them back up, let them dry. Then I always have a color wheel, and this is invaluable. It's going to help you decide your color theory. It's going to give you all the complementaries, the analogous color schemes, all of that's going to be included right in the the color wheel. So that's an important item to have. This is your transfer paper. That's how it comes, 9x13 gray. This one happens to be Master Touch right from Hobby Lobby. As you can see, you have a dark side and a gray side, and when you're doing your transferring you want to have the dark side down so that it will transfer onto the watercolor paper. This is your Bristol. What you're going to use your Bristol for is your designs. You're going to sketch your designs out on the Bristol sheet, then you'll do a transfer onto your tracing paper, which is this, and then you'll tape your transfer paper, tracing paper, onto your watercolor paper and use this underneath to transfer it onto the watercolor paper. So that's what that's for. And the tracing paper. Now I've got a couple different choices of watercolor paper here. This is my favorite. It's Arches. It is 100% cotton, which is really good because it absorbs a lot of water, which is nice. And in the watercolor technique that I teach, it does, you do use a lot of water. Now this is another one that you could use. It's Magnum 1404. So that's also 100% cotton. So that's real important to have. I like to keep a spray bottle around, and the reason is, with my palette, I take my spray bottle and I spray water on my paints, and that way they're reactivated for when I need to use them for painting. So that works out really well. I like this ceramic palette because it doesn't beat up. It'll stay in a puddle, which is what you want. I have two big areas here to blend in, so that works out really well. And it holds quite a bit of paint, so that works out well as too. Now with this spray bottle, you might actually want to use this sometimes on the back. If you're doing a background and you want to get some different texture in that background, you can spray with your spray bottle, and that'll help with that too. And then I do have a water bucket here, and I like this one because it's got 3 different sections for water, and it also has grooves that you can dry your paint brushes flat, which is really important because if you stand them up, the water is going to run into the ferrule and it will loosen up those bristles. This is the ferrule. So if the water from the bristle runs into the ferrule, it can loosen them up and ruin your brushes. So I like to keep them flat when they dry. And this bucket also has grooves on the first 2 levels of water. So that works out nice. I clean my brushes in those 2. And then I always have clean water here in this 3rd one. So that works out really well. And while we're talking about water, let's talk about the blending and glazing medium. Now this is specifically made for watercolors. It's Winsor & Newton blending medium for watercolors, and it looks just like water. what I do is I take my dropper here, I fill it up about 1/4 of an inch on the bottom and add water. And when I'm adding water to, say, for example, do a wet into wet technique, what I'll do then is I'll add this, because then I know I'm going to have a little bit longer blending time. I'm going to be able to, it's not going to dry out as fast because of this medium. I can add in 2-3 colors. I can remove paint so that we can have highlights if I want. So it's really a nice advantage, and I've gotten really used to using it on almost every technique, so that works out well. And then you do have Frisket, and what the Frisket does, and you can see at the bottom of it's yellow right now, so we need to, you don't ever want to shake it, but you can mix it back and forth like this. But what you want to do when you're trying to save white and you don't want any water or watercolor to get on the white area, put this down, let it dry completely, and then this will save that white of the watercolor paper for you. So that works out really well. Then another thing that's around the house usually is Scotch Magic tape. I always have that handy. Another item from around the house is Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. What I do is I cut them into 1-inch squares. Here you can see I was removing some color with it. Get it completely wet, wring it out, and gently wipe it across your paper, because this will rough your paper, so you have to be very gentle. But that does, if you drop something where you don't want the watercolor paint to be, this will take it off for you, so that's a really good tip. And then these are the core paints that we'll be using, not necessarily all the time. I'm a Winsor & Newton fan as well. I just got a set of Daniel Smith that I'm really excited to try out, so that'll work out nice. Many different paints out there. I always have scraps of watercolor paper handy, so I can do my mixing on my palette, put it on here, and hold it over the design to see if it's the color I'm really looking for. So it's always want to have some of those around. You do need paper towels, another thing from around the house. I usually use Viva and cut them into small squares. It's easier to handle with my brushes. And then I have artist tape. And you don't want regular masking tape. You want this to be a low residue, because if you get a regular masking tape on your watercolor paper, it's going to remove some of the surface and you won't be able to add any watercolor paint to that area. So you want to be sure that you get the right item. And then this is a Faber-Castell eraser. Works out really well. And this is a pencil eraser by Mono. I think I picked this up right at Amazon. And they have all different sizes. I also have a smaller one, and then there's larger ones as well. So those work out well. And then I like, and I think I got this right on Amazon as well, especially when I'm doing a graphite like that sketch. I always wear a glove, or when I'm painting in watercolors too, because it keeps the oils from your hands off the watercolor paper. And if that oil does happen to get on that watercolor paper, it does not pick up the paint then in that area. So that's important to have. I always have a hair dryer handy so that I can dry my paintings in between. I'm not waiting forever. Just want to make sure that there's not a lot of water on the paper as you're painting, because the hair dryer can blow that paint right across your paper, so you want to be careful there. Then I always have a palette knife, especially with the block paints, because this will remove that paper from the block, so that works out really well. I use the Sterling Edwards brushes for the backgrounds. If I'm doing a larger background, I'll get this completely wet, and if I'm doing a wet into wet technique, it works out well, but I can use this right for color as well. And I have the medium and the small. Those are the two sizes I use the most. And then I do use a normal pencil, pen, pencil, It's a little bit easier sometimes when you're doing sketches. You don't have to continuously sharpen. But I do use a red pencil and a regular pencil at times. Now these are the brushes that I use. I just have an old acrylic brush. It's just a bright, which means that these bristles are shorter than the longer bristles. That's a bright. And I do use this for mixing. So I'm not using my good brushes to do my mixing on my palette. So that you can see that one's pretty colored green there. And then since number 6 happens to be my favorite brush size, I have a couple of those sitting here. Now these are Princeton Neptunes. They're made specifically for watercolors. They hold a lot of water. So I really like this brand. It seems to be working out super well for me. And then I also have a 6, and it's a different brand, but I use this one to specifically apply water. So I never put any paint in this brush. So when and it's a different handle color, so that brings to my attention that that's my water brush. So that works out well. And then you always got a clean water brush available to you. And then these brushes, this is a nice brush. This is a 1/2 inch oval. And what I use this for is when if I'm doing a floral background and I want it darker, closer to the flower itself and the petals, I use this because I can, with that pointed tip like that that's cut specifically that way, I can get around those petals very easily with this brush. So that works out really nice. And then I just have some different size. I have another number 8, a 4, a 2, and an 0. And an 0 is a liner brush. So if you're doing some really nice line work. And then this one I use as an eradicator. And this is a chisel blender, they call it. But I use this as an eradicator, and I clean up edges of petals and things like that. So that works out really nice. Those are the brushes that I use. And it looks like I think I've covered. Oh, I also use an apron when I paint, so I would keep my clothes clean and fresh. But other than that, I think that covers all the different supplies that I use. Again, these are not mandatory supplies. These are things that I use. And as you can see, I use a lot of different things from around the house. So it's not quite so expensive all the time. But I want to thank you for joining me today, and we're going to move on to do the next segment.